The very first sentence of a book is often regarded as one of the, if not the most vital part. It is, after all, the single moment in time when a new reader is either hooked or not. In the case of SpiceandWolf, with its anime and manga adaptation, this might not be the case for every fan of the franchise, me included. Nonetheless, I wanted to focus on the original form, because it's very dear to me.
In this village, when the ripened ears of wheat sway in the breeze, it is said that a wolf runs through them.
What instantly catches me here is a sense of mystery combined with the warmth of the romanticized image of a village with the swaying wheat fields. Both aspects quickly reinforced by the mention of a simple superstition, a local superstition. Even though the actual setting is yet to be unveiled, we are able to get an idea of what this is hinting at. Simpler times that evoke an unjustified feeling of nostalgia, times in which myths still have a place in the mind of the people, and where wolves are likely still creatures to be feared.
Well, there is somewhat of a fruitless race between writers to see who can come up with the most profound first line. There is no denying that the first line can often contain the initial spark of the story. It gives us a glance into the author's fantasy, the emotion that came before all the more complex qualities of writing had time to arise. The impression which I take from this one is the image of a wolf, creature of deep forest running through a field of wheat, product of human civilization that ripens and is reaped year after year.
This is because one can make out the form of a running wolf in the shifting stalks of the wheat fields. When the wind is too strong and the stalks are blown over, it is said that the wolf has trampled them. When the harvest is poor, it is said that the wolf has eaten it.
While these lines evoke more and more beautiful imagery, the next line introduces something new.
It was a nice turn of phrase, but it had a troublesome aspect that flawed it, she felt.
A new mystery. Who is she, and what aspects flaws the turn of phrase? I presume this touches on the negativity in the former presented phrases that shift the blame for the weak harvests on her.
Still, lately, it was a popular sort of expression, and there were few remaining who wielded it with the sort of familiarity or awe it had held in the past.
The following sentence mentioned the receding respect toward those idioms, but judging by the structure of the sentence itself, starting with the separating still, I doubt that this is the aforementioned flaw. I admittedly have sometimes problems to decode the vaguer meanings and hints that will cross our path quite a lot of times in the pages to come. But hey, that's why we are here, isn't it?
It definitely is. Working with only what we have seen so far, perhaps the expression, or one similar to it, wasn't always used to condemn the wolf within. It might be that the wolf had not always trampled the wheat, and even when it did, it was perhaps seen as necessary. That would be a strange wolf indeed that the villagers could respect.
Although the autumn sky that was visible between the swaying stalks of wheat had not changed in hundreds of years, conditions below that sky had indeed changed. The villagers who tended the wheat as the years passed lived for 70 years at the most. Perhaps it would be worse for them to go centuries without changing. Maybe that is why there is no need for them to honor the ancient agreement, she thought. In any case, she knew she no longer had a place here.
This segment is, again, packed with implications. Here we get the first glimpses at some of the underlying themes of SpiceandWolf as a whole. In this case, mainly the sense of progressing entropy of the world through the lens of her immortality and the ensuing loneliness. Mixed into this is an idea of awakening and wanderlust in the last parts. This is due to the contemplative phrasing with perhaps and maybe that then disrupted by the in any case, hinting at an approaching action or rather departure of some sort.
The mountains that rose in the east caused the clouds over the village to drift mostly north. She thought of her homeland beyond those drifting clouds and sighed. Returning her gaze from the sky to the fields, her eyes fell upon her magnificent tail, which twitched just past her nose. With nothing better to do, she set to grooming it.
While the whole prologue plays with a mixture of nostalgia, warmth, loneliness and longing, there is suddenly this bit about her magnificent tail. This may be a personal thing, but the magnificence, or rather the over-dramatized importance of her tail is, as far as I understand it, more of a running gag throughout the books and thus feels a bit misplaced here. Sure, this might add to the sense of mystery, bringing up her wolfish nature and thus reiterating on the wolf of the first paragraphs, but describing it as just twitching past her nose, making it seem like a somewhat foolish entity on its own, robbed this part a bit of severity.
Mountains, sky, and memories of her homeland. All places so comfortably unchanging, yet so distant and unreachable. One's tale would surely be a trifling thing indeed in comparison to them. But unlike all those things, such tale is the ever-present reminder of one's unchanging nature and identity.
The autumn sky was high and clear. Harvest time had come again. Many wolves were running through the wheat fields.
Concluding the prologue with a small staccato of shorter sentences that contrast the longer ones that came before, underlining the closure, we have finally reached the end of the very first part of Spice and Wolf. Don't worry, this will speed up right after this last bit, but I wanted to get every minor detail here. I can't really pin down why I feel this way, but the small structure of those 3 sentences is my favorite part of the prologue. This might be a language-related thing, but I really dig the description of the sky as high. While it seemed as a bit of a senseless detail, I mean, can a clear sky even vary in height, it elicits a very specific feeling of longing and of a wide and open space for me. Thereafter, the somewhat reassuring return of the harvest time as a never-changing constant comes as a juxtaposition to the previous established impending change and returns thematically back to the very beginning of the prologue, just like the resurfacing turn of phrase.
So, that's the last then? Looks like 70 pelts on the nose. Always a pleasure. Hey, any time. You're the only one who will come this far into the mountains, Lawrence. I should be thanking you. But for my trouble, I get truly fine pelts. I'll come again. The usual pleasantries concluded, Lawrence managed to leave the village just around 5 o'clock. The sun was just beginning its climb when he left, and it was midday by the time he descended from the mountains and entered the plains.
After the emotional introduction, the actual story starts off quite ordinary. We witness our protagonist, Craft Lawrence, buying pelts off some villagers and leaving said village in the early morning hours and passing by a monastery sometime later. While all of this is happening, we get to know some of his basic traits. Lawrence is a traveling merchant, 25 years old and on his own for 7 years by now. His experience is also already established in the brief exchange in the very beginning. Additionally, the scene provides us with the info that Lawrence seems to be a committed merchant, as he is the only one willing to go out of his way to trade with an isolated mountain village. Later, as Lawrence is passing by said monastery, he is beckoned by a figure standing guard at the gates that turns out to be a young knight. Well, it seems like there's no way of writing a story set in a medieval time period without bringing up knights on the first pages, I guess. Anyway, the exchange between the knight and Lawrence reveals a lot more about Lawrence's character than the first scene.
You there, what's your business here? I am Lawrence, a traveling merchant. Do you require my service? A merchant? There's no town in the direction you came from, merchant, said the knight haughtily, sticking out his chest as if to display the golden cross that was engraved there. But the mantle draped over his shoulders was grey, indicating a knight of low rank. His blonde hair looked freshly cut, and his body did not look as if it had been through many battles. So his pride most likely came from being a new knight. It was important to deal with such men carefully. They tended to be excitable. So instead of replying, Lawrence took a leather pouch out of his breast pocket and slowly undid the twine that held it closed. Inside were candies made of crystallized honey. He plucked one out and popped it in his mouth, then offered the open bag to the knight. Careful one.
Lawrence is introduced here as a careful and analytical person. Before responding to the knight, who did not start the conversation in a friendly manner, we get to see his typical thought process. Evaluating his knowledge about the salary and life circumstances of his opposite leads to the conclusion that his best option to avoid any hassle is to more or less bribe the knight with a piece of candy. In the following dialogue, we are introduced to the load of marten furs Lawrence is currently transporting that will soon house a very special intruder.
Very well. You may pass. It was a strange way of speaking for someone who'd summoned him over so high-handedly earlier. But if Lawrence were to meekly say, "Yes, sir," now a fine merchant he'd be. So, what occasions your post here, Sir Knight?
Later, as the knight tries to end that chat, we get a glimpse at further aspects of Lawrence's merchant side. Even though he's very careful in the beginning, as he's aware that the knight is in a position of power both by law and strength, he starts to interrogate him. In a calculated and friendly manner, of course. After another tactical piece of candy, the knight speaks about the local village's pagan festival that is bound to take place. Lawrence, who is actually well acquainted with said village, denies any knowledge about it and easily manages to lie blatantly without batting an eyelid. After all, Lawrence is, at least as a merchant, quite the sly dog.
The first chapter starts off by introducing us to the first main character and our point of view throughout most of the series. Lawrence is a canny merchant, always thinking about how to use any given situation to generate profit. As for his connection to people, we see both the good merchant Lawrence, willing to travel into far mountain villages to establish connections for honest trading, and somewhat less virtuous Lawrence, willing to put up a facade and play people's desires if it means learning something which might lead to further profit. And between them, we see Lawrence on a distant and lonesome road with no people in sight.
Subsequently, we get a brief retrospect about the latest history of the decline in the church's power and the rising aggression towards non-believers, serving as a piece of evidence that the world of Spice&Wolf is set in a time period like the late 15th century. While we are on the topic of historical background, I honestly doubt that a real knight would be ordered to do guard duty. Weren't knights basically a higher social class on their own?
I'm not a historian, but I'm fairly certain they were. Then again, we are looking at the world through Lawrence's eyes, and he might simply refer to any armored soldier as a knight. It might also be a more respectful way to refer to soldiers employed by the church, or just a plain old creative freedom in writing. As for the time period, I probably wouldn't attempt to pin it as precisely. The book which served as the main source of inspiration for Isuna Hasekura, as far as we know, called Gold and Spices, The Rise of Commerce in the Middle Ages by Jean Favier, focuses on broader period called Late Middle Ages, referring to roughly the interval between 1250 to about 1500 AD. Some of the religious thoughts and developments that Lawrence is talking about might be attributed to early stages of the Protestant Reformation, which reaches way past the Middle Ages into the modern era. But there was already a Hussite movement trying to reform the church in the 15th century, so I don't think we'll have to go as far as Protestant Reformation, at least not yet.
Ending this scene, Lawrence remarked that due to the troubles surrounding the church's affair, business will suffer, cementing his jaded, if not egoistical merchant side.
It's the last bundle. Mind you, don't cut too far. Holo flees from the greedy hand. Who will catch the wolf? It's Yare!
After a few more impressions of the surrounding landscape, as our protagonist travels across the plains, once again dwelling in the imagery of rural life, we arrive at Paslower, the pagan village mentioned earlier, which is already deep into its festivities. During a custom to honor the village's harvest deity Holo, Yarai, an acquaintance and business partner of Lawrence he wanted to meet, gets locked in the village's warehouse. Having missed the opportunity, Lawrence meets the village head to have a brief chat and moves on. Meanwhile, we get to read more about his stand on religion and his connection to the village's past. Lawrence, surprisingly, turns out to be a non-believer in the church's teaching by being probably more superstitious than even the villagers.
For a bit more historical reference, I would add that despite not following the teachings of the church, we shouldn't pin Lawrence down as an outright atheist. That was a rare belief before the development of natural sciences, mostly limited to few eccentric philosophers like the ones Lawrence mentions earlier.
It's furthermore explained that he once traded wheat with the village that then suffered from high taxes for a meager profit, but did not so out of empathy but because of business pressures. Following this, the reader now gets introduced to another major part of Lawrence's personality, his loneliness.
If he'd stayed the night, he wouldn't have been able to stay long. As he sat on his wagon, Lawrence felt a sense of loneliness at being excluded thus. Nibbling on some vegetables he'd been given as a souvenir, he took the road west, passing cheerful farmers returning from their day's work. Having returned to his lonely travel, Lawrence envied the farmers with their friends.
The next paragraph goes into great detail explaining his everyday struggles with his current life. After 7 years of traveling, in which he met so many people, has seen so many different places all on his own, he's now starting to notice the creeping isolation that's slowly taking over his mind. He reflects that lately his daydreaming and subsequent sighing has increased as his thoughts begin to circle more often around his future than his current situation. He envies the villagers and townfolk, he envies them having friends in their immediate surroundings, he envies a stable life, and most of all, he envies them having company all and every day. But Lawrence is no man for self-pity. He has a plan he's working towards. He wants to achieve the dream of every traveling merchant. He wants his own shop.
Although, not a shop in the exact meaning of that word. Lawrence is currently carrying furs and some wheat, which he traded for some salt earlier, so specialization doesn't seem to be the part of his goal. With the help of Jasmine Bernhardt, the current translator of the series, I've been able to confirm that whenever Lawrence speaks of having his own shop, what he actually means is having a place of business in general. It doesn't necessarily need to involve moving large quantities of goods.
And thus, the introduction to Lawrence is more or less over, as the introduction of the other main character approaches. To recap, Lawrence is a professional sly merchant, not quite the humanist one would possibly expect as a main character, who struggles with the isolation of his job he is so proud of. He has his problems, but he also has a goal that would fix said problems. All in all, this introduction is quite solid and condensed enough to pick up the broader strokes of his character easily. A valid criticism so far would be the frequency of lore and information dumps. The author already takes his time to introduce the reader to many aspects of the world through Lawrence's knowledge that he shares in long-winded thoughts, thereby conveying his state of mind without constantly beating the reader over the head with explicit descriptions of his feelings.
Presently, he came to a river and decided to make a camp for the night. The full moon was bright, but that did not guarantee that he wouldn't fall into the river, and if that happened, calling it a disaster would be an understatement. He'd have to hang himself. That kind of trouble he didn't need.
Before we meet our other main character, I wanted to talk about this bit of text first, as it cements an important part of the world building in this series. SpiceandWolf is by no means gritty or grimdark, but manages through details like this to highlight the actual danger of its world. While the overall realism that helps grounding the story is first and foremost supported by the well-researched medieval economics and the subsequent businesses, deals and intrigues, details like the dangers of falling into a river at night in the middle of nowhere gives the setting a much-needed edge to distance it from the overly romanticized Middle Ages as portrayed by popular fantasy media. This does not imply that the world of SpiceandWolf isn't romanticized. It surely is, but it doesn't shy away from at least some nastier parts of the medieval period.
This is something that the story will keep reminding us, even when it's not exposing us to those experiences directly. And it's a good thing to keep in mind when thinking about what motivates the characters to do what they do, as their circumstances will greatly shape their actions and their worldview.
He whisked the tarp off the wagon bed. The only reason he didn't shout was because the sight that greeted him was flatly unbelievable. Apparently, he had a guest.
And now onto the introduction of our second main character, the wolf to the spice, so to say, Holo. Holo is the harvest deity of Pasloe and the she in the prologue. She is the one that had no more place there and wanted to abandon the ancient agreement. But why? And what agreement am I talking about? Well, we'll soon find out. Holo sneaked, or rather teleported into the wagon back at Pasloe and was just uncovered by Lawrence, who wanted to sleep in the marten pelts he bought in the unnamed mountain village. Lawrence is, of course, shocked and fears that his isolation finally got the better of his mind. Did I mention that his guest is also currently naked? But, being the stingy merchant he is, his next thought instantly reverts back to his practical mindset. His guest could be a prostitute and thus cost him dearly if he were to even touch her. Regaining his composure, he finally wakes her up and thus notices the beast-like ears on top of her head, making him lose his composure again. But he manages to muster enough courage to try to interrogate her before digressing into languishing on and on about Holo's beauty.
She had a terrifying allure despite her obvious youth, nestled there in the furs and illuminated by the moonlight. Her hair looked as soft as silk and fell over her shoulders like the finest cloak. The strands that fell down her neck to her collarbone drew a line so beautiful it put the finest painting of the Virgin Mary to shame. Her supple arms were so fine they seemed carved from ice. And exposed now in the middle of her body were her two small breasts, so beautiful they gave the impression of being carved from some inorganic material. They gave off a strangely vital scent, as if housed within her arresting charm was a warmth. But such a fascinating spectacle could just as soon go awry.
Before continuing with the scene, I want to discuss the still more or less hidden elephant in the room, that many people probably won't see or don't want to see. Holo's human form is throughout the books described at looking around 15 or 16 years old. Lawrence is 25. I just want to come out here and say that this difference makes me personally a bit uncomfortable. It didn't used to, as I was 15 years old myself though. Here, SpiceandWolf sadly reinforces the cliché of the sexualized underage girl, justified by the means of fantasy elements, in this case being a deity and the connected longevity. At least to some extent. If I may play devil's advocate here, the sexualization doesn't exceed descriptions of her beauty and her tendency to be naked from time to time, which in turn is related to the animalistic side of her character. SpiceandWolf does not, in contrast to many other pieces of media that tend to have such cliches, ogle Holo's body any more than what we've just read. One could go so far and make the argument that Holo's character is almost prudish in relation to her otherwise animalistic behaviors. And there are probably still plenty reasons to justify the physical age discrepancy, like the context of medieval times in which girls and boys in general were considered mature way earlier. I do not want to claim a moral high ground here, but I thought it important enough to point out and discuss before anyone could accuse me of overlooking this. I would have liked her to be described a bit older, and with that conclude this.
While the books are written for the modern audiences with modern set of morals, let's not completely ignore the historical context which the series works so hard to maintain. The concept of childhood and the taboo of nudity are still relatively modern inventions. During the medieval times, children usually weren't given any special treatment once they've gained a measure of independence, and girls were often considered women as soon as they reached the age of puberty. It is fine that this makes one uncomfortable. That might have even been the desired effect. There will be many more things in this story that aim to do just that, but I'd like to point out that Lawrence finding Holo physically attractive would have been considered perfectly normal in their time. Still, the question remains, is this necessary or does it just play into the cliché? Wouldn't Holo just as easily be an old woman, or at least Lawrence's age? My answer is that maybe she could, but it would have resulted in a different chemistry between the characters, perhaps also in a different story. Much of the story relies on Lawrence, and sometimes even the reader, forgetting that Holo is much wiser than she looks. When she's being serious, she often speaks like an old woman. When she's not serious, she often acts a little bit childish, just like an old woman. But there are few aspects to her personality which make it easy to forget.
Well, an interesting detail in this part is the mentioning of the Virgin Mary, as it makes the church in the fictional setting out to be the Catholic Church. Back to the story. Upon finally waking up, Holo goes on to howl at the moon, at which Lawrence is once more taken aback, not by surprise, but by fear.
'Tis a good moon. Have you no wine? She said, drawing her chin up and smiling slightly.
She continues to be utterly unimpressed by the fear-shaken merchant and goes on to show herself from a most divine, untouchable side, ignoring the barrage of questions Lawrence understandably hurls at her. The tension heightens as Lawrence pulls his dagger, after Holo tries to jokingly avoid the question if she's a demon or not. Lawrence, being to his own admission quite superstitious, supposes Holo might be a possessed girl that fled the village and could bring him into troubles, as possessed people are to be burned at the stakes on their discovery. After commenting on the lack of manners, Holo finally reveals her name, which is first met with disbelief. But as she goes on about explaining her past, Lawrence slowly starts to believe her. After all, he is, due to his line of business, quite confident in his ability to tell when people are lying and when they are not.
It is the name of this area's harvest god. Are you a god? At this, the girl's moonlit face was slightly troubled for a moment before she smiled. I have long been bound to this place and called its god. But I am nothing so great as a deity. I am merely Holo. Lawrence guessed that this meant she'd been locked away in her home since she was born. He felt a certain sympathy for the girl. By long, do you mean that you were born here? Oh no, this was an unexpected answer. I was born far to the north. The north? Indeed. The summers there are short, and the winters long. A world of silver. Holo's eyes narrowed as she seemed to gaze into the distance, and it was hard to imagine that she was lying. Her behavior as she reminisced about the lands of the north was too natural to be an act.
Holo then goes on to talk about her homeland of Yoitsu, and thereby strengthens Lawrence's disbelief again. At an inn somewhere in the north, Lawrence had heard the tale of Yoitsu's destruction 600 years prior, which Holo does not seem to know herself. Because of his continuous doubts, Lawrence acts as if he had never heard of it before and asks about any other places she might know in the north to confirm if she's lying or not. What's a little odd here is that Lawrence gets away with his lie, as Holo is later revealed to be able to discern any lie with her wolfish ears. Maybe because this is more on the bending the truth side of things.
What places do you know? He asked. A place called Yoitsu. Lawrence forced himself to say, don't know it, to quell the unease that rose within him.
In the English translation, one could argue that he in fact does not know the place, as he had never been there, or at least in the general area where it used to be, even if he had heard of it. It would be interesting to see if there's an even more distinct difference in the original Japanese text. I honestly doubt that such a mistake in such a crucial situation would make its way into the book. But Holo also seems to be a bit absent-minded in this scene, as she inquires about the well-being of Yoitsu seconds after Lawrence told her that he doesn't know it. As Holo is able to name Niohira, a town in the north that's famous for its hot springs, she manages to reassure Lawrence that she is in fact from the north, and as she sneezes and subsequently comments on the downsides of a human form, the remains of hostility between them are washed away. From here on, the scene becomes less tense and focuses more on the emotions and motivations of our main duo.
There was something that still worried him, though, so he spoke to Holo as she snuggled into the fur pile. You said something about changing forms earlier. What was that about? At his question, Holo poked her head out of the pile. I meant just what I said. I haven't taken human form in some time. Charming, no? She said with a smile. Lawrence couldn't help agreeing, but he kept a straight face as he replied. The girl could make him lose his composure, that was certain.
To erase the last bits of doubt that Holo is the Holo of Paslower, Lawrence bids her to show him her real form. A funny bit of foreshadowing here is the early realization on Lawrence's side that Holo can make him lose his composure, as the constant teasing between them will develop into a major part of their relationship as we follow along, just like the small provocation Lawrence teases her with.
Aside from a few extra details, you're a human. Or what else? Are you a dog turned human? Like the stories of horses turning human.
To which Holo goes full on wise wolf.
You can doubtless tell from my ears and tail that I am a proud wolf. My fellow wolves, the animals of the forest, and the people of the village all acknowledge me. It is of the white tip of my tail that I am the proudest. My ears anticipate every misfortune and hear every lie, and I have saved many friends from many dangers. When one speaks of the wise wolf of Yoitsu, they speak of none other than me.
Statements like this one are a common occurrence with Holo in the chapters and books to come. While this surely insinuates a really bloody annoying character trait on the surface, it should be prematurely noted that Holo's self-pleased and smug side is more or less the most superficial layer of a character, and there are some pits behind her outward confidence, some of which we are going to see early signs of in the following paragraphs. With the request to show her true form, Holo shows us a glimpse of the aforementioned character depth, as she at first remains unwilling to transform as she does not want to scare Lawrence. Her reason is not just a simple care for Lawrence's temper, but rather that people tend to behave differently as soon as they know they are dealing with a deity. They start to behave in a respectful, but very distanced manner, and this distance is something Holo wants to tear down after God knows how many years alone in the fields of Paslower. On one hand, Holo does not want to be treated special, and on the other one, she's proud of her special condition as a wise wolf. She just doesn't want to be excluded. What I think is quite interesting here is that usually characters in an isolated situation are on the bottom of whatever hierarchy they are in. Other people keep their distance because they want nothing to do with said character. Quasimodo from The Hunchback of Notre Dame springs to mind. Here, those roles are flipped on their head. The powerful or in some way ruling role is the isolated one and wants to flee his or her current situation. This setup is probably done to death in literature already, but this was, for me, quite a refreshing situation. One might be inclined to compare this to every prince or princess fleeing from their respective life of wealth and power to go on adventures. But in this case, the responsibilities, that are usually the reasons that start their escape, are not put upon the characters by outside forces, i.e. the rich and powerful parents, but rather their own sense of duty. For the ancient agreement, that is.
If you would pretend to be strong, you might first hide your trembling hand, Holo said, exasperated. Lawrence looked down at his hands, but by the time he realized his mistake, it was too late. You're an honest sort.
After some more teasing, Holo musters the trust to at least transform her arm for Lawrence to see, which results in a bit more back and forth between the two. Interestingly enough, Lawrence remarks his incapability to touch the now transformed arm as his failure as a man, indicating a bit of macho behind his facade. A facade that currently also hides a constant agonizing over the question if he should leave Paslower without their deity. By the way, Holo's transformed paw would indicate a wolf that's roughly about as big as a horse, contrary to the depictions in the anime and manga, which tend to be at least twice that size.
Here I would interject with something that might save many questions in the future. There will be several statements made during this first volume, and maybe even a few later on, for which we could easily find at some later point a statement or an illustration saying or showing something completely different. Holo's size in both her wolf and human forms is a good example. In this chapter, we read that Holo is supposed to be about 2 heads shorter than Lawrence, although in no illustration is he shown to be more than a head shorter. This is to be expected. No writer can perfectly foresee how every little detail will fit and feel within their story. So, in the beginning, we'll see Isuna Hasekura feeling his way through the story to find the right spot for the characters, their looks, and their other attributes. In this case, he might have simply seen Isuna Hasekura's illustrations and decided that he liked that slightly taller Holo more than he liked the Holo he first described. From my experience of reading these books, I would say that Hasekura is a writer that's not afraid to cut his losses and pay a small price in consistency if it means fixing a small detail, to be more in line with the overarching image of the story and its characters.
To revise his behavior here a bit, since it might not be so clear up to this point, Lawrence is throughout the whole scene a bit overwhelmed by the situation, understandably so. But that seems to be not only due to the supernatural elements, as he constantly falls for Holo's traps like...
said Holo meekly, looking up at Lawrence. Be gentle, will you? Lawrence couldn't help stopping his hand short at her suddenly endearing manner. He looked at her, and she looked back, grinning. You're rather charming, aren't you? She said.
He's going to touch a gigantic clawed paw in that moment. Just for clarification. Initially, I was going to excuse Lawrence's behavior with his untrained social skills and, more precise, his inability to talk to women, as it's a quite common trope. But upon the second read-through, I am doubting that that's even a reason at all. I don't want to forestall too much, but Lawrence is very capable of talking to women, just like he's very capable of talking to anyone. He is, after all, a merchant, and social skills are his bread and butter. But there's a difference between having social skills and being a social guy. And the 7 years of being an outsider definitely left a dent on his personality that seems to contribute towards him being off guard. From there on, Holo goes into detail on her relation with Wheat and how she escaped the village, as she should have been in the last stalks that have been harvested. However, as Holo calls Lawrence her savior with a certain distaste, he tries to get even with her by suggesting bringing her back to Paslow, as he doesn't want to see the village suffer. Even though that comeback wasn't meant to be serious, at first it hits a vulnerable spot. Holo, now robbed of her confidence, asks him for help. There are many reasons and different ideas why Holo suddenly slumps into this defenseless position. At first I was surprised seeing her so clingy all of a sudden. But it's important to note here that Holo's desire to put an end to her loneliness is at least equal to Lawrence's. And judging by the interaction between them, I'm willing to infer that Holo already took a liking in Lawrence. But given they still just met, there might be more to this. Later on, it's revealed that Holo is bound to the reed stock she teleported into earlier. But if such an artificial cause is the basic reason why she's forced to stay with him for the start of the story, it would contrast the usual power dynamics between the two. Holo is a mightier entity, but puts on the facade of a small girl to walk the human world. To put it bluntly, she could tear Lawrence and his horse asunder in seconds and make off on her own. Seeing her robbed of that position of power so easily seems somewhat unjust and taints a beautiful setup to some extent, if this is the sole reason for her to stay with Lawrence. But swallowing one's pride, especially if that one is called God from time to time, and putting one's life in the hands of a stranger is a courageous act in and of itself. And also, there's still the possibility of it all being an act to charm Lawrence. To summarize, I still haven't reached a conclusion on how to interpret this reaction. Anyways, as Lawrence finally manages to condense his inner turmoil into the question if Pasloa would survive without Holo, she reacts with anger. Not towards Lawrence, but the village itself. Holo explains in a state of suppressed wrath that she spent hundreds of years in the village even as she started to long for a home to keep the ancient promise she made to ensure the village's harvest. But as time has gone on, the villagers started to blame her more and more if the harvests were behind expectations. Now, Holo considers the promise fulfilled and felt that her presence is no longer necessary, as the village starts to use more modern farming techniques and thus replacing her. If anyone hasn't catched up on this yet, that was basically what the prologue was about. Holo is a relic from a time-long past and wants to connect with her old world, her old friends, to seek a new place for her to be. This theme will accompany us through the books, so more in-depth discussion will come up as this is brought up again. Within this part, there's a chunk of text that summarizes a lot of the things that made me fall in love with this series.
The land doesn't need me, and the people don't certainly need me either. Getting her words out in all one breath, Holo sighed deeply and fell over on the pile of furs yet again. She curled up, pulling the furs around her and burying her face in them. He could not see her face to make certain, but it seemed not impossible that she was crying. Lawrence scratched his head, unsure of what to say. He looked helplessly at her slender shoulders and wolf ears. Perhaps this was how a real god acted, now full of bluster and bravado, now yielding a sharp wit, now showing a childish temper. Lawrence was at a loss at how to treat the girl now. Nevertheless, he couldn't very well remain silent, so he took a new approach. In any case, setting aside the question of whether or not that's all true, "You think me a liar?" snapped Holo at this preamble. He faltered, but Holo seemed to realize that she herself was being too emotional. She stopped, abashed, and muttered a quick, "Sorry," before burying her head in the furs again.
The emotional writing and the subtle, well-meaning interactions between our two protagonists shine a moment like this, and there's this little part where Holo quickly notices her own misbehavior and apologizes. This is a microcosm of another strength of our heroes, or the writing in general. SpiceandWolf avoids devolving into melodrama throughout the whole series, exactly through its self-reflecting characters that act mature enough to put their own feelings aside to judge their current situations. And the story beats that get emotional carry a weight that I have never felt myself with any other story I've read, heard, or saw before.
"I wish to return north," she said flatly. "North." Holo nodded, turning her gaze up and off into the distance. Lawrence didn't have to follow it to know where she was looking. True north. "My birthplace, the forest of Yoitsu. So many years have passed that I can no longer count them. I wish to return home." The word birthplace left Lawrence momentarily shocked, and he looked at Holo's profile. He himself had not visited his hometown once since embarking on the life of a wandering merchant. It was a poor and cramped place of which he had few good memories. But after long days in the driver's seat, sometimes loneliness overcame him, and he couldn't help thinking fondly of the place. If Holo was telling the truth, not only had she left her home hundreds of years ago, but she'd endured neglect and ridicule at the place in which she'd settled. He could guess at her loneliness.
After regaining her composure, Holo finally voices her wish to return home. Also, this paragraph points out the basic similarities between Holo's and Lawrence's situation as outcast, providing more reasons for Lawrence's sympathy towards her, next to being a naked, good-looking girl in his wagon that's somewhat at his mercy. What I want to point out here is that this quiet scene of Holo sitting in this wagon somewhere, gazing north with a heart filled to the brim with longing and loneliness, just tugs at my heartstrings. I think I like it so much because it doesn't try to be overly dramatic. The landscape isn't special, Holo isn't sitting on an ancient rock formation, and there's no dramatic breath in the right moment. It's just an ordinary wagon on an ordinary night, even though it's full moon, okay, with an extraordinary girl wanting to go home. Sure, Holo's specific situation is something special, but the wish to return home isn't. It's not about the fate of humanity or the protection of the universe, but about nostalgia and longing mixed with wanderlust and joy. Lawrence, trying to keep up to his expectations of himself, asks for a night's sleep before answering Holo's plea to accompany her to her homeland, even though he already seems to be quite sure about his answer. As the initial suspicions between the two finally faded, and as an early sign of trust, they agree to share the wagon's bed. As Lawrence lies down and awes at the fact that he finally has some company on a cold night, he also wonders about Holo's earlier behavior, hinting at the possibility that Holo's defeated demeanor might have been an act to persuade him.
Seeing her like this, Lawrence wondered if her actions earlier were something of an act, as if she were trying to play the part of the imprisoned princess.
The next day starts with Lawrence waking up just to catch Holo as she rummages through the wagon, on which a characterizing thought crosses his mind.
"Hey now, those are mine!" Even if it wasn't actual theft, even a god shouldn't be rummaging around through other people's things.
Holo, without a care in the world, ignores him and goes on to ask if the clothes she found look good on her. But before he can start lamenting about the worth of the items she picked for herself, she took his best attire after all, Lawrence makes a relevant observation.
Seeing her like this made the uncertain, overwrought Holo of yesterday seem like something out of a dream. Indeed, it seemed that the real Holo, the one he'd have to contend with from here on out, was this impudent, prancing thing.
From here on we get to see the other side of Holo's character. Even though we haven't seen her wolf form entirely, there might be a comparison to make between her moods and her forms. Holo from yesterday's night, the thoughtful, mostly serious divine entity, fits well with her wolf side, while the carefree, playful and jesting side resembles a human form as a teenage girl. Of course I don't want to imply that these different sides of her character are somehow distantly separated, they are two sides of the same coin after all. She also jests when she's in an earnest mood, as we could watch in the scene before, and in a good mood she's also sharp-witted and wise. But these sides, the playful girl and the stern wise wolf, are at the core of her being and won't always get along smoothly. After mulling over the worth of the dress Holo put so casually on and finding himself unable to get mad, Lawrence is confronted with the question he refused to answer earlier and that will kickstart the story.
So, I wish to travel with you. May I? She smiled, but did not seem to flatter. If she tried to flatter him, Lawrence felt there might have been reason to refuse her. But she simply smiled happily. Lawrence sighed. She didn't seem to be a thief at least. He couldn't let his guard down. But it wouldn't hurt to let her come along, and sending her away would only make the constant loneliness harder to bear. This must be some kind of fate. Very well, Lawrence said. Holo did not appear especially overjoyed. She merely smiled.
To revert to Holo's character side real quick, I'd like to point out that it's obvious here that her, well, for lack of a better word, girlish side also possesses the aforementioned severity of the wise wolf. And I really like I don't know how to describe it better, the honesty in this scene. It's this calmness, the mere smile at the perspective of things to come. The honest but polite way of asking if she may travel with him. The joy of both characters that are now finally able to end their respective loneliness, even though they barely know each other. After a short exchange in which Holo reassures Lawrence that she won't freeload off him and will earn her stay, our protagonists finally spring to action. Holo points out that it's about to rain, though they gather their things and are off on their way.
After Lawrence roused the horse, collected the bucket, and took the reins in hand, Holo joined him in the driver's seat. It was too big for one person, but slightly too small for two. But to ward off the chill, too small was just right. With the neigh of a horse, the pair's strange travels had begun.
And thus, the travels of the Spice and the Wolf begins.